Hey all, Matt Hepworth here, and today we're going to take a look at whether Avid's new Carbon interface is a better upgrade for your studio than an Apollo X. Stay tuned. So, the Universal Audio Apollo is probably one of the most popular interfaces on the planet. And now there's a new contender, and that is Pro Tools Carbon, which is a new interface touting the lowest latency of anything and giving a lot of options for an upgrade path and direct competition to the Universal Audio Apollo. In fact, at first glance, and forgive the pun, you might even say it's a carbon copy of the Apollo X8. So we're going to contrast several aspects of each interface, and I am determined to help you answer the question of which interface is right for you based on this video. We're going to contrast these with latency, sound quality, plugins, overall value, and limitations, pros and cons list. Let me preface this by saying that I have been a Pro Tools user for 15 years, particularly Pro Tools HD. And when we think of Pro Tools HD, which is now called Ultimate, we're usually thinking about a DSP-based system, whether it was TDM or later HDX. I've also been an Apollo user since 2012, so I feel qualified, because I own both and have used both extensively, to really contrast Apollo and Carbon and help you determine with maybe a little less headaches than it took me to determine my choices and my goals. First off, let's talk about Carbon. So Pro Tools Carbon has a lot going for it. Of course, it's Avid's new poster child, and there are good reasons for that. First off, it has the lowest latency of any Pro Tools setup, period. I know that seems like a big statement, but it does. And there's going to be some nerd talk in this video, but the short version is, Avid tried to replace TDM systems, which were a very reliable low latency system, with HDX. And for some people, HDX was a good fit. For others, it wasn't. And to be frank, it is higher latency than a typical TDM system. And that's kind of been a big disadvantage that Avid has had for years. And so people like me have struggled and stuck with TDM for years and years because there really wasn't a better alternative. Now, Apollo started to get a lot closer to that, but you don't have that exact Pro Tools workflow where you have one window, one interface, everything's seamless, playback, tracking, it all plays back and sounds exactly the same on playback as it does while you're tracking. I mean, those are a few things that take a lot to get right with an Apollo, but are possible. But they're things that TDM systems pretty much did right out of the gate, and HDX systems can sort of do right, but with some caveats that there's a lot more latency when you're doing it that way. So latency is one of the things that I'm going to keep harping on because it's one of the most important things. And if you're looking at Carbon, you're probably concerned about latency. That's probably one of the biggest reasons that you're looking at it. In general, 2 milliseconds of latency and below is what we're aiming for, because that's the point where the comb filtering effect, especially for vocalists, that's caused by the resonance of your bone and everything versus what's coming through your headphones being slightly delayed. You get comb filtering effect and it causes phase cancellations and some weird things. So in a very extreme setting with high latency, the latency is actually a delay. Whereas when you're looking at shorter latencies, it can be something as similar to, or something that's similar to a chorus effect, or something that's barely noticeable. And one other thing with latency, as you get under 0.5 milliseconds, you get an almost analog feel, although sometimes you might have to flip the polarity for things to sound exactly right if you're comparing the acoustic sound in the room, whether it's an acoustic guitar or a vocal, versus what's coming through your headphones. Sometimes it might sound thin. So now with Carbon, Avid's new poster child, it provides a really, really good low latency experience. The latency at 48 kilohertz is under 1 millisecond. In fact, it's around 0.75 milliseconds. By comparison, Apollo X at 48 kilohertz is just a little under 3 milliseconds. So there is a substantial difference there. And with Apollo X, you are kind of out of that sweet spot of 2 milliseconds or less when it comes to vocal recording or acoustic guitar recording. And so for a lot of us, we've kind of gone to higher sample rates to help combat that. And that's one thing that's nice about Luna, Universal Audio's new free application that comes with Apollos. It's very Pro Tools based, very similar feel if you're used to working with Pro Tools. and it is sample rate agnostic. And so you can record your live tracking with a full band at 48 kilohertz or 44.1 kilohertz, where the latency is not such a big deal for a scratch vocal. And then when you want to record your final vocals or do overdubs for vocals or acoustic guitar, you can switch to 96 kilohertz and have very, very low latency. At 96 kilohertz, Apollo is 1.1 milliseconds, which is very good. And that's why I myself, and a lot of others like me, track critical things like vocals and stuff at 96 kilohertz. It's not for the sound quality, it's for the lower latency. So when we're contrasting the latency, obviously Carbon is really good on paper, really low numbers. But that's not all of the story. You also have plug-in latency. Unlike universal audio, where you have over 100 plugins with zero added latency, every single plugin you add in Carbon adds latency. At the very least, you're going to add 9 to 10 samples. Doesn't seem like a lot, but it is, especially because most of the plugins that are not Avid are actually adding 33 and 34 samples, 0.75 milliseconds. So 2 of those together add a millisecond and a half, and you go from 0.75 milliseconds to out of the sweet spot. You're no longer under 2 milliseconds, and comb filtering becomes an issue. So there are 2 schools of thought on latency. There are some people that really don't notice the difference, and mostly because they haven't tracked analog. And then there are the other people that are really sensitive to it. And for the people that don't really notice the difference, a lot of them are fine with even 5 milliseconds of latency. Pro Tools HD Native, for example, is just under 4 milliseconds of latency at its lowest buffer setting. So substantial increase from Apollo and a substantial increase from Carbon. And when we're talking about HDX and TDM, both of those hover right around 2 milliseconds at 48 kilohertz. But only TDM can do 2 milliseconds at 48 kilohertz with several plugins in the chain. That is not possible with an HDX system. In fact, HDX systems in particular, if you add 3 or 4, say, plugin alliance plugins, you're going to have latency that's very comparable to native systems, and it completely wipes out the benefit of DSP. So now let's talk about quality. Both these units are high quality. It doesn't matter if you have an Apollo X or a Carbon, you're going to get excellent results. Now, they are neck and neck as far as the AD conversion goes. They both have very clean preamps with comparable gain. And as far as noise goes, they're quite comparable, maybe a slight edge to Carbon as far as preamp noise when they're both at full gain. One place where they are different is the DA. The DA on Apollo X is substantially better than the DA on Carbon. And unfortunately, that is the weak spot on Carbon. The DA is a little subpar, in my opinion, compared to other units at a similar price. One of the reasons for that is probably to get the latency as low as it is. A lot of times, higher quality converters introduce a little more latency, which is the reason that Apollo X has a higher DA latency than the older Apollos, like the Mark IIs and the Silverface, because that new DA conversion is top-notch. It's great. So now let's talk limitations. Carbon is pretty much suited for one thing, and that is Pro Tools tracking. It has pretty dreadful native performance, so if you're not using an AAX DSP plugin, you're getting pretty terrible performance, in the realm of 15 to 20 milliseconds. So unusable in a lot of instances. By the same token, if you're doing virtual instruments, again, it is a little more difficult, although virtual instruments are only reliant on about half that latency, because only the output buffer affects it. Still, you're talking about 10 milliseconds roughly as a minimum with instruments. That's still a lot of latency. Apollo, although not designed for native performance, still has a pretty decent native spec, better than USB interfaces in general, and better than most FireWire interfaces as well. So, let's go pros and cons on the Carbon. 1, latency. It is unmatched on anything that runs on Pro Tools, period. And it is a lot lower latency than the Apollo. Number 2, simplicity. There is a fantastic experience when you're working with a single window where all you have to do to turn on that hybrid engine and get the lowest latency is record Armatrack. Super simple. It does not get better. That brings us to integration, which is one more pro that it has. Although integration isn't perfect yet in Pro Tools, we do at least have good compensation on the inserts without any hassle. We also have the simple fact that every plugin you put in there will run natively for playback and AAX DSP for tracking, as long as you're using anything that has an AAX DSP version. It's going to have a native version. One of the other pros is the inputs. Carbon has 24 inputs, and that's a great number. Even though Apollo also has 2 sets of ADAT inputs, they are only used for SMUX, and so you can only use a total of 8 channels of ADAT with Apollo, whereas you have 16 channels of ADAT with Carbon. For a lot of users, that may not be a big deal, but for people like me, I'm constantly feeding Carbon with either 16 channels of Symphony I/O from Apogee, or 8 channels of Symphony I/O and 8 channels of Apollo through using it like an expander, which we won't really talk about in this video. Pro Tools included free. That's another really big benefit on Carbon right now. And lastly, selectable impedance. So this is different from how Unison works. Apollo has a great interaction with the impedance and everything with Unison. Carbon doesn't have that, but it does at least have selectable impedances, which do change subtly the color of whatever you're plugging in, whether it's high Z or microphone. You get a few other color combinations, and so it doesn't necessarily have to be the cleanest preamp. You can add just a little bit of color by changing that impedance setting. Now let's talk about cons. And there are several cons, and they are substantial. One is plugin latency. We've already talked about this, but it cannot be overstated. 4 plugins added to a channel are adding a significant amount of latency, 3 milliseconds roughly. That's horrible. On a TDM system, 4 plugins would add 12 samples. But with HDX and Carbon, each plugin is adding 33 samples, 34 samples, or more. And again, when you're adding 3 milliseconds of latency just by adding 4 plugins, which would be, say, a fast compressor, a slow compressor, so you can kind of do the LA2A 1176 thing, an EQ and a de-esser, there's your 4 plugins, and you're now at basically 4 milliseconds, that's terrible. That's native latencies. Speaking of native latencies, I would consider Carbon to not be a very good interface for anything native, especially because you're usually going to have your buffer at around 256 for stability and CPU loads throughout a project. At that buffer, you're talking about that 17 milliseconds of latency, and that is a lot of latency. That is unusable for most anything other than some basic virtual instrument stuff because you're only dealing with the output buffer. And that's the same reason that another con is this is not really a great interface for any other DAW. It is exclusively good in Pro Tools. There's no benefit of using Carbon in any other DAW because you have none of the hybrid engine, you have none of the AAX DSP processing, anything like that. Another con is the fan. And no, the fan is not loud. It was initially, but they've made some changes through some updates. So I don't think the fan is a terrible thing, but it will spin up from time to time. And when it does spin up, then you've got that little bit of noise in there. And so it's not really suitable for any quiet tracking. Probably the biggest con of Avid Carbon is the plugin selection in AAX DSP format. It's kind of dismal. None of your standards are there. There's no recent LA2A, there's no recent 1176, there's no API EQ, there's no Neve EQ, there's no recent tape. So you're really limited in what you have available. And yes, there's a good 1176 that Plugin Alliance makes, but it's not 34 samples latency. It's a lot higher, so it's not really usable for tracking, unfortunately. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like things are going to get much better in that department because you're not getting things added to AAX DSP very much. You're actually getting things dropped. So Softtube, which makes a good FET compressor that would be a good equivalent to the 1176, has already dropped support for AAX DSP on that. So it's not a great situation plugin-wise, especially because none of the standards exist. But yes, there are a lot of workarounds, and there are a lot of good sounding plugins. Honestly, I like Smack. I like the Avid channel strip. I like the Metric Halo channel strip. There are lots of good usable plugins, but if you want to go to the tried and true LA2A, into a 1073 or an API EQ, you can't. It is not possible in AAX DSP at this point. Hopefully, there will be more development that resolves some of that, but right now it's just a big hole. And then another con is the I/O. You are limited to 24 inputs and outputs. Technically 25 if we count the talkback. And speaking of talkback, that is not a great talkback. It does the job, and some of the updates have made it a lot better, but unfortunately it's right next to the fan, and so there is a hum that is a tone, and then sometimes you'll even hear wind noise and things like that as the fan spins up. A lot of improvements have been made, but it is not something that I could see ever wanting to record, because personally I have to put a gate and I have to put an EQ to try to eliminate some of those tones that you can hear through there. And so based on that alone, it works as a talkback, but it's not something you'd want to record. So I don't think we should count that toward the 24 I/O. And so back to the 24 I/O, there is no way to expand that. You cannot add another carbon, you cannot add HDX, you cannot add anything else. You are limited to 24 total. And that's not a lot. It seems like a lot, but when you're talking about multi-mic drum setups and taking a DI from every guitar and taking a DI from some of the heads as well, you're going to use up those really quickly. I'm used to working with 32 I/O, which is almost always enough, and a typical session for me is 28. So I had to make some sacrifices to get down to the 24 that Carbon allows. And lastly, the DA. Although there's nothing inherently wrong with the DA, it's pretty average sounding. And the specs are a little lower than a lot of things in the similar price range. Well, than most everything in that price range, in fact. Again, I personally think that the DA was chosen because it sounds pretty good and has very low latency. But I do wish that the DA was better, and without the ability to add a SPDIF DA converter or anything like that, you're kind of stuck with that for the most part. I personally send 8 channels of ADAT out to my Symphony, and I monitor through a couple of those for my Symphony instead, because I highly prefer the DA on the Symphony. Again, not that it's bad, it's just pretty average.